The clouds had been building since noon, dark and heavy along the western ridge, and Josephine Calloway knew from 3 seasons in Montana Territory exactly what that particular color of sky meant. She knew it the way she now knew most things about this land, the hard way, alone, with no one left to warn her ahead of time. She was up on the roof beam when the first far-off thunder rolled across the valley, straddling the ridgepole with a mouthful of nails and the hammer that had belonged to her husband gripped in her right hand. 6 months along, and then some, her belly making every reach and twist and negotiation her body did not always agree to. Down below, the cabin walls stood square and true, 4 of them, raised log by log across a summer of mornings that began before dawn and evenings that ended by lantern light. Only the roof remained, half-framed, open to a sky that intended to test it before it was finished. She drove another nail home, the hammer strike ringing out flat and hard across the empty land, and told herself, as she told herself most days now, that she had until October to prove this claim, and October was not so very far off, and neither was the child. Daniel had started the cabin in the spring, before the fever took him in 6 short days, before Josephine understood that a woman could bury a husband and keep a homestead claim only by finishing what he had begun with her own 2 hands. Because the land office in Bozeman did not care for grief, only for a roof raised and a door hung by the date written on the paper. She had cried for exactly 1 week after they lowered him into the ground on the rise above the creek. Then she had picked up the tool roll that had been his and found the hammer still warm somehow from the summer sun through the canvas and gone back to work. Because the alternative was losing the only thing Daniel had left her, which was 160 acres of good bottomland and a half-built cabin and a child who would need somewhere warm to be born. She had asked herself once, in the worst of that first grieving week, whether it might be simpler to give up the claim and take a room in town, work as a housekeeper for someone else. Let the land go back to the government the way so many widows before her had. The thought had lasted about as long as it took her to look at the 4 raised walls Daniel had built before the fever took him, and understand that giving up the claim would mean giving up the last thing his hands had made in this world, and that she was not prepared to do. The nearest neighbor of any consequence was Caleb Sutton, who ran cattle on 11,000 acres to the east and was, by every account Josephine had heard since arriving in the territory, the richest man in 3 counties. She had met him exactly twice. Once at the land office, where he had tipped his hat and offered nothing more than a good day, ma'am, once on the road into town, where he had slowed his horse alongside her wagon long enough to ask whether she needed anything. No, she had told him. He had nodded once and ridden on, and she had been grateful for that, because she had grown weary of men who asked a question already certain of the answer they wanted to hear. What she did not know, and would not learn until much later, was that Caleb Sutton had watched her wagon disappear down that road and thought of another woman entirely. One whose grave sat on a low hill on his own land, a wife he had buried 9 years back along with a daughter who never drew a breath. The sight of a woman alone and carrying and refusing help had gone through him like a blade turned twice. He said nothing of that to Josephine. He simply rode home and, for reasons he did not examine too closely, told his foreman to keep an eye on the Calloway claim without letting the lady of the house know she was being watched at all. The storm broke over the ridge just as Josephine drove the last nail she had brought up with her, and the first hard drops came sideways on a wind that made the half-raised roof groan against its joints. She climbed down carefully, 1 rung at a time, her hand never leaving the ladder, her other hand pressed flat and instinctive against the curve of her belly, and reached the ground just as the rain came in earnest, soaking through her dress and plastering her hair to her face. She stood there a moment in the downpour, looking up at the unfinished roof, half of it now dark with rain where the shingles had not yet gone on, and felt something close to despair rise in her chest before she pushed it back down, the way she had learned to push most things down that year. Tomorrow, she spoke it to the empty yard, to the rain, to the ridge beam that still needed 6 more days of work she was not certain her body had left to give. I will finish you tomorrow. Caleb Sutton had ridden out that same afternoon to check on a break in his north fence line, and it was the storm that turned him back early. And it was the turning back early that put him on the ridge road above the Calloway claim, just as the rain hit its hardest. And it was pure chance, or something Caleb would later think was not entirely chance, that made him look down into the valley at exactly the moment Josephine came down off that roof alone, into a storm, 6 months and more along, with no one on earth watching to see whether she made it safely to the ground. He did not ride down that day. He told himself later that it would have embarrassed her, a rich man appearing out of the rain to hover over a task she had clearly not asked him to help with, and there was truth in that. But there was another truth underneath it, which was that Caleb Sutton had spent 9 years keeping the whole world at the length of his considerable fortune, letting money stand in the place where closeness used to be, and something about Josephine Calloway coming down off that roof in the rain, refusing to fall, refusing to call for anyone, had reached past all of it in a way he did not yet have words for. He rode home instead and stood a long while at the low hill where his wife and daughter were buried, and did not pray exactly. Only stood there with his hat in his hands until the rain stopped. Then he rode back to his house and told his foreman that come morning he wanted 4 good men and enough shingle stock to roof a cabin, and that they were to bring it to the Calloway place, and that not one of them was to say who had sent them unless the lady of the house asked directly. Josephine woke the next morning to the sound of hammers that were not her own. She came out onto the half-finished porch in her robe, her heart lurching with a fear she recognized instantly, the old fear of men arriving on your land uninvited, and found 4 riders already up on the roof she had spent the whole summer raising, laying shingle in neat overlapping rows with the easy competence of men who had done this work 100 times before. "Who sent you?" she called up. The oldest of the 4, a weathered man named Purdy who worked as foreman for the Sutton Ranch, climbed down and stood at a respectful distance, hat already off. "Nobody sent us exactly, ma'am," he said it carefully. "The way a man says something he knows is not the whole truth. We heard tell a woman was roofing a cabin alone with a baby coming, and we had a slow morning, and figured a slow morning was better spent useful than idle." Josephine crossed her arms over her belly, unconvinced. "That is not an answer, Mr. Purdy." Purdy had the grace to look uncomfortable. "No, ma'am," he admitted. "It is not." She stood there a long moment, torn between the pride that had carried her through every hard week since Daniel died, the pride that said a woman ought to finish what was hers to finish, and the plain, aching truth of her own exhaustion. The ache in her shoulders that had not eased in a month, the child pressing lower every week, the roof that truly did need more hands than 2. Finally she spoke again, quieter now. "You may finish the north side. I will do the south myself." It was not surrender. It was a line drawn carefully, and Purdy, wise enough not to argue with it, only nodded and climbed back up to work. Caleb did not come himself that first day, and Josephine noticed the absence of him more than she expected to, though she told herself it meant nothing, that a rich man sending his hired hands was still only charity dressed up as neighborliness, and she had learned to distrust anything that arrived looking like charity. He came on the 3rd day instead, riding out alone in the late afternoon when the crew had already gone home, and found Josephine still up on the south side of the roof, working the last of the shingles into place by herself in the long gold light. The hammer that had been the property of Daniel swinging steady in her hand, despite everything her body was telling her about how tired it had grown of this particular labor. He did not call up to her right away. He sat his horse at the edge of the yard and watched a long moment, the way a man watches something he does not want to interrupt because interrupting it would somehow diminish it. Then he swung down and stood at the base of the ladder. "That is fine work, Mrs. Calloway." She looked down, recognized him, and felt the old wariness rise before something else pushed past it, something closer to simple tiredness that no longer had the energy to be wary. "It will hold through winter," she called down. "That is all fine work needs to do out here." He climbed the first few rungs, not all the way, only enough to hand up a fresh bundle of shingles she had set aside for the morning. She took them without comment, and for a while they worked in a companionable quiet that neither of them tried to fill with talk, which suited Josephine better than any conversation a man had offered her in a long while. When the light finally failed, she climbed down, and Caleb was there at the bottom of the ladder, not offering his hand exactly, only standing near enough that she understood it was there if she wanted it. She did not take it. She came down the last rungs on her own, the way she had done every day that summer, and stood facing him in the yard with the finished roofline dark against a sky gone orange and violet. "Why did you send your men?" She asked it plainly, arms crossed. "And do not tell me it was a slow morning." Caleb considered the question a long moment, the way he considered most things, slow and deliberate. A man used to weighing cost before he spent anything, whether coin or truth. 9 years ago I buried a wife and a daughter on a hill not far from here. He let that sit a moment before he went on. "I have spent every year since letting my money do the work that closeness ought to do instead. I did not send my men because I thought you needed rescuing, Mrs. Calloway. I sent them because watching you climb down off that roof alone in a storm was the first thing in 9 years that made me want to do something with my hands again instead of my bank account." Josephine had not expected that. She had expected excuses, or worse, some quiet assumption that she owed him gratitude shaped a particular way. She had not expected a grief laid open plainly on the ground between them, offered without any request that she pick it up. "I am sorry." Her voice had gone soft. "For your wife. Your daughter. I am sorry for your husband." He said it plainly. "I did not know him well. I know the cabin he started, though. It is good work. You have finished it the way he would have wanted, I expect." She looked at the hammer still in her hand, worn smooth in the grip from a summer of use, and felt her throat tighten in a way she had not allowed herself to feel in front of anyone since the funeral. It was his. She turned the hammer once in her hands before she went on. "I did not know how else to keep him close, except to keep using it." Caleb nodded slowly and said nothing more about it, and something in the not saying more felt like the kindest thing anyone had offered her in months. There was a morning that week when a calf belonging to the Sutton herd wandered onto Calloway land and got itself tangled in a stand of old wire near the creek, bawling and thrashing until it had cut a shallow gash along one flank. Josephine heard it from the garden and went to it herself, moving slow and careful with her weight the way she had learned to move that summer, and worked the wire free with steady hands while the animal trembled and finally stilled under her voice. She was cleaning the wound with water from the well when Caleb rode up, having missed the calf at evening count and followed its trail to her fence line. He found her kneeling in the grass with a strip of clean cloth already wrapped around the animal leg. The calf calm now, leaning its head into her shoulder the way frightened creatures sometimes leaned into the first steady thing they found. He did not offer to take over. He only knelt across from her and held the calf still while she finished the wrap, and when it was done he sat back on his heels and looked at her a long moment. "You did not have to do that yourself." He said it eventually, quiet, still watching her. "I did not have to do most of what I have done this summer," Josephine answered, wiping her hands on her apron. "Seems a poor reason to start waiting on someone else now." He laughed at that, a short surprised sound she had not heard out of him before, warm and a little rusty, like something that had not been used in a while and was glad to be taken down off its shelf. She found herself laughing back, quietly, and thought it strange how easily laughter had returned to her that summer, considering how certain she had been in the spring that she had used up whatever store of it she had left. The days that followed settled into a quiet, careful rhythm. Caleb came most evenings after his own work was done, never announcing himself, simply appearing at the edge of the yard with some small, useful thing in his hands: a coil of rope, a sack of nails, a jar of preserves his housekeeper had put up too many of. He never stayed long enough to make his presence a burden, and he never once tried to finish a task Josephine had not asked him to finish. She found herself, without quite meaning to, watching for him some evenings before he arrived, and did not examine that watching too closely, because examining it felt like admitting something she was not yet ready to admit, not with Daniel barely 5 months in the ground and a child coming who would never know his face. The trouble arrived a week later, in the shape of a man named Silas Pruitt, a land buyer out of Helena, who made his living finding claims about to fail and buying them cheap from desperate families before the government reclaimed them outright. Pruitt had heard, the way men like him always heard, that a young widow was homesteading alone near the Sutton Range, heavily pregnant, with a deadline in October, and he had ridden out to make her an offer he was certain she could not refuse. He found her in the garden and made his offer plainly. $200, cash in hand for the claim. He let the number sit a moment before he went on. "You will likely not prove it up in time, regardless. Better you take the money now than lose the land and the improvements on it for nothing come winter." Josephine straightened slowly, one hand at the small of her back, and looked at him with an expression that made even a man as practiced as Pruitt take half a step back. "The roof is on, the walls are square, the well is dug." She said it flat and even, each fact laid down like a nail driven home. "I have 3 months left in a finished cabin standing behind me right now, Mr. Pruitt, and I do not intend to hand it to a man who counts on desperate women not reading their own paperwork." The smile on Pruitt's face thinned. "Word around the territory is you have had considerable help finishing that roof. Land office might take a dim view of a claim proved up mostly by the hired hands of another rancher. Might call the whole improvement into question. I would hate to see you lose it for a technicality when $200 in your pocket today is a certainty." It was a threat, dressed as a kindness, and Josephine recognized the shape of it immediately, because she had spent enough of her life learning to recognize men who wronged you gently enough to call it help. You are welcome to raise that concern with the land office yourself. Her voice did not rise, though something hard had come into it. "I imagine they will want to know why a speculator is so eager to see a widow disqualified 3 months before her deadline. I imagine that conversation will interest them considerably more than it interests me." Pruitt left without his $200 and without the satisfaction he had ridden in expecting, but Josephine understood, watching him go, that this was not finished. Men like Pruitt did not simply accept a refusal. They found other doors. He found his other door 2 weeks later, riding into the county land office in Bozeman and filing a formal complaint questioning whether the Callaway improvements met the requirement of being made by the claimant herself, citing the well-known fact, as he put it, that hired hands from the Sutton Ranch had been seen roofing the cabin on multiple occasions. The land agent, a cautious man named Whitcomb who did not relish controversy, sent word that Josephine would need to appear before him in person, along with any witnesses she cared to bring, to settle the matter before her deadline could be certified. Josephine received the summons 3 days before what the midwife guessed would be her time, and felt something in her, Some last reserve she had been drawing on all summer, come dangerously close to running dry. Caleb rode out that evening, having heard of the complaint from Pruitt by way of Purdy, who had heard it from a teamster, who had heard it in town, the way everything traveled in a county that size. He found Josephine sitting on her own front step in the last of the light, her hands folded over her belly, staring out at the cabin she had built with a look on her face that he recognized, because he had worn it himself for 9 years. "I will not let him take it," Caleb said, sitting down on the step beside her without being invited, close enough that she did not have to raise her voice to be heard on her good side. "I will ride to Bozeman myself. I will tell Whitcomb exactly what I saw with my own eyes, that you were up on that roof from the first log to the last shingle, and that my men laid maybe a third of the north side and nothing more, and that the rest of it, every board and every nail, came from your own 2 hands. That will not be enough," Josephine said quietly. "Pruitt will say you are protecting a neighbor. He will say the word of a rich man buys whatever version of the truth he wants told. Then we will bring the truth itself." Caleb turned to face her fully now. "Not my word. The work. Let Whitcomb ride out here himself and see the calluses on your hands and the roofline you framed and the well you dug before you were too far along to swing a pick. Let him see it the way I saw it. A man cannot argue with what stands in front of him." Josephine turned to look at him then, really look, the way she had not quite let herself look at any man since Daniel, and found in the face across from her none of the pity she had braced for and none of the quiet ownership she had learned to fear in men who offered help. There was only a steadiness there, the same steadiness that had stood at the bottom of a ladder without ever once reaching up to pull her down off it before she was ready to come down herself. "All right," she let out a slow breath. "Bring him." Whitcomb rode out 3 days later, on the same morning, as it happened, that Josephine woke before dawn with a low, insistent ache low in her back that she recognized immediately for what it was. She said nothing of it at first, determined to see the land agent through his inspection before she allowed her body to have its say in the matter, and she walked Whitcomb across the claim herself, showing him the well, the garden rows, the notches she had cut into every log by her own hand, her palms raw and calloused, as proof no speculator complaint could argue against. It was Caleb who noticed, midway through the inspection, the particular way she had begun to pause and breathe through certain moments, her hand pressed flat against the small of her back. He crossed to her side without announcement. "Josephine." He kept his voice low, angled toward her good ear. "Is it time?" She looked at him, and for the first time all summer did not try to hide the truth of her own body from anyone. "I believe it is." Her hand pressed flat against her back as she said it. What happened next was not written down in any land office record, though it ought to have been, because it settled the complaint from Silas Pruitt more thoroughly than any inspection could have. Whitcomb, land agent though he was, found himself riding hard for the nearest doctor while Caleb Sutton carried Josephine Calloway into the cabin she had built with her own hands and laid her down in the bed her husband had framed before he died, and stayed exactly where she told him to stay, at her side, holding the hand she finally, for the first time all summer, allowed herself to hold. The hours that followed were long and hard, the way such hours always are, and Josephine bore them the way she had borne the whole of that year, without complaint, without apology, gripping Caleb's hand so tight at the worst of it that he would find the mark of her fingers on his skin for days after, and neither of them minded that at all. The child came before the doctor did, a girl, strong-voiced and pink and furious at the world the way newborns always are. And Josephine held her against her chest in the cabin she had built alone, log by log, nail by nail, through a summer of grief and rain, and the slow, careful courage of a stranger. and understood that whatever Silas Pruitt had written in his complaint no longer mattered, because there was no version of the truth left standing that could argue with the sound of her own daughter crying in a house that had not existed 6 months before, except in the stubborn refusal of one woman to give up on it. Whitcomb returned 2 hours later with the doctor, took one look at the scene in front of him, and quietly withdrew his consideration of the complaint on the spot, noting in his official report that he had personally witnessed improvements to the Callaway claim that exceeded requirement in every particular, and that any further inquiry into the matter would be, in his professional judgment, a waste of the land office time. Silas Pruitt left the territory within the month, his reputation for preying on vulnerable claims having finally caught up with him in a county too small to forgive it twice. Caleb Sutton did not leave. He came back the next week, and the week after that, at first with reasons, a fence to check, seed to share, and then eventually without pretending to need one at all, simply arriving in the evenings to sit on the porch of the cabin Josephine had built, holding a daughter that was not his blood but had somehow become, in the quiet accumulation of small, ordinary evenings, something very near his heart. Autumn came on slow and gold across the valley, the kind of season that seemed determined, after everything, to be gentle with them both. Josephine watched Caleb some evenings with the child asleep against his chest, a man used to counting acres and cattle by the thousand, holding one small warm weight like it was the only sum that had ever truly mattered to him, and thought that grief, given enough patient time, did not disappear so much as it made room for something to sit down carefully beside it. Purdy came out himself one Sunday that October, hat in hand, to meet the new arrival, and stood in the yard a long while looking at the finished cabin the way a man looks at a piece of work he has come to respect. "You built a fine place, Mrs., roof still holding." He said it slow, turning his hat once in his hands. "It will hold a good many winters yet," Josephine answered. The baby settled warm against her shoulder. "You and your men helped see to that." Purdy shook his head slow. "We laid some shingle. The rest was yours from the ground up." Man would have to be blind not to see which parts were which. He tipped his hat then and rode back toward the Sutton Range, and Josephine stood watching him go, thinking that word traveled fast in a county that size, and that for once the word traveling was the truth of what she had built rather than some smaller version of it. The hammer that had belonged to Daniel hung above the mantel now, the first thing Josephine had done once the cabin was truly finished, driving one final small nail into the beam above the hearth and hanging the tool there where she would see it every day, not as a wound anymore, but as a marker of what it had helped her carry through. She found Caleb looking at it one evening that autumn, the two of them sitting by the fire with the baby finally asleep between them. "I could not have finished the roof without your men." She said it looking at the hammer, not at him. "I want you to know I know that. You could have." Caleb said it plainly, no flattery in it. "You would have gotten there eventually, storm or no storm, because I have never seen anyone less inclined to be stopped by circumstance in my whole life. I did not send my men because you needed them. I sent them because I wanted, for the first time in 9 years, to be some small part of something being built instead of something ending." Josephine reached over and took his hand, the same hand that had stayed steady beside her through the hardest hours of her life, and looked at the cabin around them, whole now, warm now, holding a fire and a sleeping child, and a man who had learned, the slow, careful way, that strength did not need rescuing so much as it needed someone willing to stand beside it without ever once trying to take the hammer out of her hand. Outside, the first frost of the season silvered the grass across land that had, against every hard prediction anyone had made that spring, become exactly what Josephine Callaway had refused to stop believing it could be. A home. Finished, standing, hers, and now, in the quiet, accumulating way of ordinary evenings, no longer only hers alone.